They said she died with her secrets buried deep in the dirt of that Appalachian valley. But the soil never forgets. Not the screams, not the sins, not the bloodlines that twisted together where they never should have. Her name was whispered in fragments, carried on the wind through the hills of West Virginia. Some called her a victim, others a curse. But everyone knew one thing: her family tree didn't grow. It folded in on itself. For decades, her descendants lived like shadows, hidden from the world, trapped in a story too shameful to be spoken aloud. Yet behind that shame was something far darker, something deliberate. This wasn't just a tale of backwoods isolation or poverty. This was the story of a woman who chose to defy every boundary, every law of nature and morality, until even the blood in her veins turned against her. They said she became pregnant by her own grandson, and that wasn't even the most horrifying part. Because by then, the line between mother-child and grandchild had already blurred beyond repair. It wasn't love. It wasn't madness. It was something older, something inherited, passed down like a curse, sealed in the faces of those who could never leave that valley. Historians don't talk about her. Newspapers erased her, but her blood still flows quietly in the forgotten corners of America. And if you trace it far enough back, through the censuses, the obituaries, the sealed court records, you'll find her name. You'll find the woman who became her own ancestor. And tonight, we open the pages that were never meant to be read. This is not just a story about one woman's sin. It's about how a family becomes trapped inside itself, until the only person left to love is someone they were never meant to. So listen carefully, because once you hear her name, you'll understand why no one dares to speak it again. She was born in a place where the mountains swallowed the sky, in a cabin that leaned against the hillside like it was too tired to stand. There were no hospitals, no churches for miles, only a handful of families who'd lived there for generations, all sharing the same few last names. The people in town said they kept to themselves, but that wasn't quite true. The truth was that they didn't have anyone else to turn to. Her mother was also her aunt, her father, possibly her grandfather. And by the time she was old enough to understand what family meant, she'd already stopped asking questions. Because in that valley, blood wasn't sacred, it was destiny. It tied you to the land and to the faces that looked too much like your own. When she was 15, she was told she would marry. No preacher, no papers, just a whispered agreement between men who believed women were property, not people. The man she was promised to was twice her age. Her cousin, maybe her uncle, depending on which version you believed. She gave birth to her first child before she turned 17, and by then, her eyes already carried that faraway look. The one people get when they stop hoping for anything better. There was no cruelty in her voice, no rebellion, only silence. Because silence was how her people survived. Outsiders were dangerous, outsiders judged. So they built their own world, one that obeyed its own rules. And in that world, the concept of wrong blurred into something almost natural. Decades passed, and her children had children. Each generation seemed a little more broken, not just in body, but in mind. The doctors who came to the valley on rare occasions wrote words like genetic abnormality and degenerative disorder. But those words couldn't capture the truth. The deformities weren't just physical, they were spiritual, as if the soul itself had begun to collapse in on its own reflection. And at the center of it all stood her, the matriarch, quiet, unmoving, watching her family twist and fold into itself like vines strangling the same dying tree. But she didn't stop it. Some say she couldn't. Others say she wouldn't. Because by then, she believed she was preserving something, a bloodline chosen by God, even if the rest of the world called it sin. They say she started to change after the flood of 42. The river rose and swallowed half the valley, washing away homes, livestock, even the cemetery. When the water receded, she found the ground had shifted, graves opened, bones scattered, names lost, and maybe something inside her opened too. Something old, something no one could ever put back. Her husband had died by then, or disappeared, depending on who you asked. Some said he was swept away by the flood. Others whispered she let him go. Either way, the matriarch remained, alone, except for her children and their children. And when her eldest grandson came of age, that's when the story crossed the line from tragedy into something else entirely. He was barely 17, tall, quiet, with the same gray eyes she once had. Neighbors saw him bringing her food, chopping wood, sitting on the porch beside her until the sun went down. They thought it was devotion. They didn't know it was the beginning of something unspeakable. No one knows when it happened or why. Some say it began out of loneliness. Others believe she'd gone mad after the flood, convinced she could keep her bloodline pure by turning it inward. Whatever the reason, months later, she began to show signs of pregnancy. People asked questions, but she had no answers. Or maybe she just refused to give them. When the baby came, she told everyone it was her daughter's. But the math didn't add up. The age, the timing, the way she kept the child so close, refusing to let anyone else touch it. It was all wrong. And in a place where rumors traveled slower than rivers, that one spread like wildfire. The child didn't live long, born frail, silent, and strange. They said its eyes were open from the first breath, as if it already knew too much. Some swore they heard her singing lullabies to it at night, songs no one else recognized, in a language older than the hills. And when the baby died, she buried it behind the house herself, under a tree whose roots ran deep enough to hide any sin. After that, the valley changed. Livestock began to die without reason. Families moved away. The ones who stayed began to see things, faces in the windows at night, voices in the fields. It was as if the land itself was reacting, rejecting the weight of what had happened. And through it all, she sat in her chair by the fire, staring into the flames, as if waiting for someone, or something, to come back. By the time the outsiders came, the valley was already half forgotten. Government men in dusty trucks, holding clipboards and questions no one wanted to answer. They'd heard stories about sickness, about strange births, about a family that hadn't mixed with the outside world in nearly a century. They called it a survey, but everyone in the hills knew what it really was, an investigation. They found the matriarch sitting on her porch, rocking slowly, her hair gone silver, her eyes clouded but sharp enough to see through anyone. She greeted them politely, even offered them tea. But when they started asking about her family, about the graves out back, about the names on the birth records that didn't make sense, her smile faded. One of the men later said it felt like she was studying them, not the other way around. Like she knew something they didn't, and never would. He said her eyes were cold, but not cruel, just empty. As though she'd seen so much sin that judgment no longer meant anything. The officials wrote their reports. They used words like isolation, consanguinity, genetic decay. They photographed her house, the family, the graves. But those photos never made it to the archives. Somewhere between the valley and Washington, they disappeared. Some say the government buried the evidence, not to protect her, but to protect the country's image, because no one wanted to admit that something like this had grown from American soil. The locals, though, never forgot. They said the air around her land felt heavier. Birds wouldn't fly over it. The trees leaned away, their branches twisted, as if the forest itself didn't want to touch her home. When she finally died, they couldn't find a preacher willing to bury her. So her children, or grandchildren, no one could tell anymore, dug the grave themselves. No marker, no prayer, just dirt, closing over decades of silence. But even then, people swore they could feel her presence. The rocking chair still creaked at night, even when the wind was still. And if you passed by after dark, you could see the faint glow of firelight flickering inside that abandoned cabin, as if she were still there, waiting for someone to come home. Years turned into decades, and the story of the matriarch became a warning, a whisper parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But the bloodline didn't end with her. It never does, not completely. Somewhere along the way, one of her descendants left the valley, carrying with them the trace of what began there. You can still find it if you know where to look. In certain faces, in old photographs, in the way some families refuse to talk about their past. Researchers tried to map her lineage once. They stopped when they realized the branches kept folding in on themselves. Brothers marrying nieces, uncles raising children who were also cousins. Every record was a dead end. Every name connected to another in ways that defied logic. The family tree looked more like a spiral, closing tighter with each generation until there was no beginning or end. It's easy to call it madness. Easier still to say it was evil. But maybe it was something else. Something that happens when a family becomes trapped in isolation long enough for their world to shrink to the size of their own reflection. A mirror that only shows you the faces you already know. There's an unease in stories like this, because they force us to look at what happens when love becomes obsession, when blood becomes the only thing that matters. The matriarch wasn't a monster in her own eyes. She was a guardian, a keeper of her people's blood, a woman who believed the outside world was poison, and that purity meant survival. But purity can rot just like anything else, and when it does, it consumes everything it touches. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have left, or would you have stayed, carrying the curse in silence like the generations before you? Because sometimes, the only thing more terrifying than the sins we inherit is realizing how easily we could repeat them. The house still stands. The roof has caved in, the porch half swallowed by vines, but the foundation refuses to crumble, like the memory of the woman who built it. Travelers sometimes find their way there, chasing rumors, ghost stories, or just the thrill of trespassing on haunted ground. Most leave before sunset. Those who stay claim they hear things. A lullaby drifting through the trees, the soft creak of a rocking chair, the faint laughter of a child who never grew up. A historian once wrote that places like that don't die, they wait. The earth remembers every footstep, every whispered secret, every sin that went unconfessed, and in that silence it breeds echoes. The matriarch's land is one of those echoes, a graveyard disguised as a home. Decades after her death, a construction company tried to buy the property to clear it for new housing, but the workers refused. Their tools broke, their trucks stalled, and one man swore he saw a woman standing at the window, staring at him with eyes pale as fog. They said the air felt wrong, heavy, like it was watching them. The project was abandoned within a week. Her descendants, scattered now, refused to speak of her. One of them, an old woman in Kentucky, once told a reporter that every night she dreams of a tree, roots wrapped around bones, branches shaped like hands reaching toward the sky. She says she knows who they belong to. She says they're waiting for her. There's something deeply American about her story. Not the flag, not the pride, but the forgotten corners where people vanish from the record, where generations are swallowed by poverty, isolation, and superstition until they become ghosts while still alive. The matriarch wasn't just a woman. She was the embodiment of what happens when the world stops looking and no one comes to save you. And maybe that's why her story still clings to the air like smoke. Because deep down, we know that beneath all our progress in cities and lights, there are still valleys where the blood remembers and the past is never really gone. They say the past is dead, but that's a lie we tell ourselves so we can sleep. The truth is, the past never dies. It just waits for us to dig deep enough to find it again. And when we do, it looks back at us with our own eyes. The matriarch's grave was never marked. No stone, no name, no date. Just the faint impression of something once human beneath the soil. But even now, people who visit that valley say the ground feels warm there, as if something beneath still stirs. The air hums, low and steady, like a heartbeat trapped in the dirt. Some believe it's her spirit still guarding the bloodline she built, or cursed. Others say it's the land itself, trying to forget what was done upon it. If you look through old archives long enough, you might find traces of her. A census record with the same names repeated, a birth certificate with no father listed, a photograph too damaged to identify the faces. She's there, hidden in plain sight, folded into American history like a stain that will never wash out. Because she isn't just one woman. She's every forgotten mother who did what she had to survive, every secret buried in the name of family, every generation that paid the price for the sins of those who came before. In the end, her story isn't about horror or madness. It's about inheritance, the kind that doesn't come in wills or deeds, but in silence, in the unspoken, in the way families rewrite their own histories until no one remembers the truth. Maybe she believed she was keeping her bloodline pure. Maybe she thought she was saving her people from extinction. But what she really did was show us the cost of isolation, the danger of walls built too high, of loyalty turned inward until it becomes decay. So if you ever drive through the hills of West Virginia and see a cabin half hidden by trees, don't stop. Don't take pictures. Don't touch the door. Just keep driving, because some stories were never meant to be found. And remember this, the blood remembers, even when we try to forget.